Welcome to Think Outside the Box, a deep dive. This is part of the Teacher Victoria ESL class, and I love diving into these fascinating topics with you. And today we're going to be looking at something that feels incredibly familiar. We've all heard it countless times. Happily ever after.
Happily ever after, right? Those three words just sort of signal the end of so many stories.
Yeah.
And it always feels like the natural conclusion. But what's interesting is, what if this seemingly timeless ending hasn't actually been around for all that long?
Right. It feels like it's always been there. It's just such a standard part of so many stories. So that's going to be our mission today. We are diving deep into the surprising history of happily ever after in fairy tales.
Yeah, we're going to take a look at where these stories originated and how that really iconic ending became so widespread.
Yeah.
A really fascinating stack of information here that traces how these tales have actually transformed over centuries. So stick with us.
Yeah, this is going to be good. And remember, if you have any thoughts or questions about the class or this deep dive, be sure to drop Teacher Victoria a message.
Absolutely. All right, so happily ever after. It feels like it's always been there, right? Like a standard ingredient in the fairy tale recipe. But our sources paint a much more nuanced picture. What struck you most about the beginnings of these stories?
Well, for me, the biggest surprise was just how different the earliest versions were from the often gentler tales we know today.
Yeah.
We're talking centuries ago before these stories were actually written down. They existed as like a lively oral tradition shared by communities, and these weren't necessarily the sweet bedtime stories that we might imagine today.
No, it makes sense. These were, in a sense, survival guides that were passed down through generations. Just imagine, people gathered around a fire or in a marketplace sharing these narratives, and they often contain, warnings and lessons reflecting the tough realities of life. Like the symbols and metaphors within those early tales were intended to help people understand and navigate the dangers around them. When you think about that world, it was very different.
Yeah, and the examples are pretty eye-opening. Like, our information mentions early versions of Little Red Riding Hood, where there isn't a, grave woodsman who saves the day.
Right.
The little girl and her grandmother, they simply get eaten. The end. And that's a pretty stark contrast to the version most of us grew up with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Cinderella wasn't always about a lost glass slipper and a charming prince. Some of the older tellings include the stepsisters actually harming themselves, mutilating their feet to try and fit into the slipper. And then you have these pretty gruesome punishments later on, like birds pecking out their eyes. It really highlights that the initial purpose of these stories wasn't primarily lighthearted entertainment for children.
Yeah, not at all.
Not at all.
So this leads us to the individuals who started committing these stories to paper, and in doing so began to reshape them. And we're talking about figures like Charles Perrault in France during the late 17th century.
Yeah.
What do you think about him?
Perrault was a pivotal figure. His collection, Histoire ou Contes du Temps Passé, gave us the versions of classics like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Puss in Boots that we're still largely familiar with today. But it's really important to consider his intended audience. He was writing for the French aristocracy, a very different group than the people who originally told and heard these tales centuries before.
Absolutely. So the stories became more refined, more elegant, and significantly, I think, more moralistic. We begin to see a shift towards happier resolutions, often centered around marriage, the restoration of social order. It's as if the stories were being polished for a different kind of consumption.
Yeah, for a more courtly audience.
For a more courtly audience, exactly.
Yeah.
Then about a century later, we have the Brothers Grimm in Germany. And their initial aim was to document and preserve what they believed to be the authentic folk stories of the common people. But what's so interesting is that they almost immediately started making changes to those tales.
Right, and that is so interesting. You would think that they would just, be these purists that were like, we're just going to take it down exactly how it was.
Yeah, just preserve it. Yeah.
But no. Our sources point out that the early editions of their children's and household tales were still quite raw and even violent in places. But as they continued to publish and revise their collections, they softened some of those harsher elements, introduced more overt Christian values, and crucially for our topic today, began to give more stories those satisfying, uplifting endings.
Yeah, and what do you think the motivation was behind this shift?
Well, it's really fascinating. The 19th century in Europe saw this change in how childhood was understood. Children were increasingly viewed as like a distinct audience for literature. And there were these evolving ideas about what those stories should teach and convey. The Grimms, while initially focused on preservation, were also aware of this growing child readership, and they adapted their tales accordingly.
So they kind of started out as collectors, but they ultimately played a big role in shaping the narratives to fit the perceived needs and expectations of middle-class families.
Yeah, it's fascinating how influential they were.
It is.
In the trajectory of these stories.
Right, so we see this gradual movement towards happier endings. But where does the actual phrase happily ever after enter the picture?
That's another interesting layer. Our research indicates that the specific phrase happily ever after seems to have become more established in English language stories around the early 18th century. And one of the earliest recorded uses is actually in a 1702 English translation of Boccaccio's Decameron, where it appeared as they lived very lovingly and happily ever after.
So it wasn't necessarily a phrase invented specifically for fairy tales, but rather one that just found its way into them and became really popular.
Right.
It's interesting that similar sentiments existed in other cultures as well, like the Danish saying they lived happily until they died, or the peaceful and fulfilled endings found in some Arabic storytelling traditions.
Yeah, that suggests like a universal human desire for resolution and a sense of like lasting contentment. But the crystallization of this into that neat, almost formulaic phrase seems to be a more specific cultural development, likely influenced by both literary trends and, as our sources suggest, even early forms of marketing of these stories.
This deep dive is brought to you as part of the Teacher Victoria ESL class. And if this is sparking any thoughts or questions for her about the class itself, be sure to drop Teacher Victoria a message.
Absolutely, let her know.
Okay, so let's talk about Disney. We can't talk about fairy tales without talking about the huge influence of Disney.
We can't. Walt Disney's animated films in the 20th century really cemented the happily ever after ending as the definitive standard for fairy tales.
Yeah.
At least in the Western world.
Yeah.
Think about films like Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. In all of these good triumphs over evil, wrongdoing is punished, and romantic love conquers all, culminating in that satisfying, happy conclusion.
Right, and these films were so incredibly impactful, visually stunning, emotionally resonant, and as you said, commercially successful. They became like the primary way many people, especially in Western cultures, encounter these stories. But our sources also point out that Disney often significantly altered the original narratives to achieve these feel-good endings.
Yeah, a perfect example is The Little Mermaid. In Hans Christian Andersen's original story, the mermaid doesn't get her prince. She faces a tragic end, turning into sea foam, or in some later interpretations, becoming a spirit. Disney completely rewrites that, giving her the prince and a happy life in his kingdom. I mean, that's a fundamental shift in the story's underlying message.
Yeah, it really highlights how much these adaptations can change our perception of the original intentions and meanings behind these tales. So with this widespread adoption of happily ever after, our research raises a really interesting question. What might we have potentially lost along the way?
Yeah, this is where a more critical perspective comes into play. Thinkers like Jack Zipes argue that these sanitized, always happy endings actually strip fairy tales of some of their original purpose and power. They were intended to be more than just simple escapism. They served as tools for grappling with real-world anxieties, injustices, and hardships.
So by always insisting on a happy ending, we might be losing some of the nuance, the moral complexities, and the valuable lessons about resilience in the face of adversity. Like the idea that characters could persevere and even find meaning without a picture-perfect resolution seems to have been more present in the older, less neatly packaged tales.
Right. Our sources suggest that the original fairy tales weren't necessarily making promises of guaranteed happiness, but perhaps offering strategies for navigating life, even when happiness felt elusive. There's a different kind of strength and wisdom to be gleaned from those stories that don't tie everything up with a perfect bow.
It really makes you think about the impact of constantly expecting that happily ever after in our own lives. Does it shape our expectations of relationships and our ability to cope with life's inevitable challenges? It's certainly something worth pondering.
Oh, it truly is. So this deep dive into the history of happily ever after reveals that this seemingly simple phrase has a much more recent and intricate history than we might have initially assumed. From those often dark and cautionary oral traditions to the more refined and moralistic written versions popularized by Perrault and the Grimms, and then those hugely influential and consistently feel-good endings championed by Disney, fairy tales have been in a state of constant evolution.
And it's fascinating to consider how these shifts reflect changing cultural values and the intended audience for these stories. The earliest tales, they often acted as these raw survival guides, confronting difficult realities head-on, while later versions often prioritize clear moral lessons and ultimately that sought-after guaranteed happiness.
And you know what's interesting? The absence of that guaranteed happy ending in those older tales might even offer a different kind of comfort, as our research suggests. Acknowledging that life isn't always neat and tidy, and that the capacity for perseverance, even without a perfect resolution, is incredibly important and valuable.
We hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective on those familiar stories and that seemingly simple phrase. What does it mean to you now knowing its history? Has it perhaps changed how you view these tales or the messages they convey? This is just the beginning of a really engaging discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, part of the Teacher Victoria ESL class. We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, and please don't forget to send Teacher Victoria a message with your feedback or any questions that this exploration has sparked for you. Until our next deep dive, keep thinking outside the box.
See you next time.